The lighting rig at the edge of the Western Street set groaned once, then collapsed in a cloud of dust and sparks, pinning a grip named Danny flat against the wooden boardwalk, while the rest of the crew stood paralyzed. Remember this, because what John Wayne does in the next 45 seconds, while everyone else is still staring, will become a story the studio tries to bury for years. The California sun had been beating down on the fake frontier town since dawn, turning the packed dirt street into something that radiated heat like a furnace. Wooden storefronts lined both sides of the main drag, their false facades propped up by invisible supports that the cameras would never see. John Wayne had been standing near the saloon entrance, going over his blocking with the director for a confrontation scene they had been trying to get right all morning. 3 takes already, and none of them had the energy the script demanded. The afternoon was slipping away, and everyone on set could feel the pressure building like storm clouds on the horizon. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? And what time is it right now? The lighting rig that fell was one of the big ones, a 40-foot tower of steel and cables that held 6 massive arc lights, the kind they used to simulate perfect sunlight, when the real thing cast shadows in the wrong direction or sat too low in the sky. It had been standing at the edge of the street set for 3 full days now, repositioned twice as the shooting schedule changed, and the director decided he needed different angles. The grips had checked it that morning, or at least someone had signed off on a checklist saying they had. But checklists don't stop metal from fatiguing over time, and they don't stop bolts from working loose under the constant vibration and stress of a working film set. Danny Murrow was 26 years old, married for less than a year to a woman named Sarah, who worked as a schoolteacher in Burbank, with a baby on the way that he talked about to anyone who would listen. He had been working as a grip for 4 years now, starting as a day player who showed up hoping for work and gradually earning his way up to a regular position on the crew. He was good at his job, careful, methodical, the kind of man who double-checked his own work because he understood that mistakes in this business could get people killed. He was standing on the wooden boardwalk, adjusting a bounce board, when the rig above him made a sound like a wounded animal and began to fall. Nobody knew about the stress fracture in the main support beam. It had been there for months, invisible to the naked eye, growing a little wider every time the rig was moved and reassembled. The safety inspection that should have caught it had been delayed twice because of budget concerns. The replacement parts that should have been ordered never were, and now in the space of 2 heartbeats, all of those small failures were about to become one catastrophic collapse. The rig didn't fall straight down the way you might expect from watching movies. It twisted as it went, the upper section swinging outward in a deadly arc that sent heavy cables whipping through the air like steel snakes looking for something to strike. Danny looked up at the sound of groaning metal, and for one frozen instant that seemed to stretch into eternity, his eyes met the falling mass of equipment with the absolute certainty of a man who knows he cannot possibly get out of the way in time. Look at the moment of impact from where Wayne was standing, 30 feet down the street. He saw the rig begin to tilt. He saw Danny's face turn upward. He saw the terrible mathematics of distance and speed that meant the young grip had no chance to run. And then he saw the whole structure come down with a crash that shook the wooden buildings and sent a cloud of dust billowing across the set like a wave. Then silence. The kind of silence that follows disaster, when the world holds its breath and waits to see what comes next. Wait, because this is where everything changes, not in the crash itself, but in what happens in the seconds that follow. The crew stood frozen in place. 30 men and women who worked with heavy equipment every single day, who knew exactly how dangerous a collapsed rig could be, who understood instinctively that the wrong movement could bring more debris crashing down on whoever was trapped beneath it. They all stood absolutely still, their brains struggling desperately to process what their eyes had just shown them. All except one. John Wayne was running before the dust had even begun to settle. He didn't wait for the safety coordinator to arrive on the scene. He didn't look around for the set medic or call out for help. He didn't calculate the risks or consider the liability, or spend even 1 second thinking about what the studio executives would say. He just ran, his boots pounding against the hard-packed dirt of the fake frontier street, his coat flying behind him, his only thought focused entirely on the man who might be dying under that twisted mass of metal. "Danny!" Wayne's voice cut through the shocked silence like a knife. "Danny, can you hear me?" A sound came from beneath the wreckage. Not words, just a low groan of pain that meant the grip was still alive. For now, Wayne reached the edge of the collapsed rig and dropped to his knees in the dust without hesitation. The structure had fallen at an angle, with the main beam resting heavily on the wooden boardwalk and the upper section tangled in the decorative overhang of the general store facade. Danny was pinned beneath a section of steel tubing, his lower body trapped completely while his upper half remained free. His face was white with shock and pain, and there was blood on his forehead where something had struck him hard on the way down. "Don't move." Wayne's voice was calm now, steady, the voice of a man who had decided to take control of a situation that no one else seemed capable of handling. "I'm going to get you out of here, but you need to stay still. Can you feel your legs?" Danny's eyes focused on Wayne's face. Yeah, I can feel them. They hurt." "Good. Pain means they're still working." Wayne looked up at the tangle of metal above them, assessing the structure with the quick, calculating gaze of a man who had spent 30 years on film sets and knew exactly how these things were built. "I need you to tell me if anything shifts. If you feel the weight change, you yell. Understand?" Danny nodded, his jaw clenched against the pain. Notice what Wayne does next, because this is the moment that separates the man from the legend everyone thought they knew. He didn't wait for help to arrive. He didn't delegate the dangerous work to someone younger or stronger or more expendable in the eyes of the studio. He reached directly into the wreckage with his own bare hands, grabbed a section of twisted steel tubing that was still warm from the lights, and began to lift. The metal groaned in protest. Fine dust sifted down from the tangle above. Somewhere in the mess of cables and supports, something heavy shifted with a grinding sound that made everyone watching hold their breath and pray. "Easy," Wayne muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Easy now." He lifted the tubing 6 inches off the ground, then a foot. The weight was enormous, far more than any one man should have been able to handle alone. But Wayne's face showed nothing but absolute concentration as the muscles in his arms and shoulders strained against the crushing load. "Slide out," he said through gritted teeth. "Slide toward me, now." Danny pushed himself backward, with his arms, dragging his trapped legs through the gap that Wayne had created. 1 inch, 2 inches. The metal above them groaned again, threatening to collapse further. "Keep going. Don't stop." Danny pulled harder, his fingers digging into the wooden planks of the boardwalk, and then suddenly he was free, his legs sliding out from under the debris just as Wayne's strength finally gave out and the metal crashed back down onto the spot where the grip had been trapped seconds before. For a long moment, neither man moved. They just lay there in the dust and debris, breathing hard, their hearts pounding, while the rest of the crew finally began to move toward them with shouts and running footsteps. "Stop for a second and look at this scene from above. There's John Wayne, the biggest star in Hollywood, covered in dust and sweat, his hands scraped raw from lifting jagged metal. There's Danny Murrow, a grip that most people on set couldn't have picked out of a lineup, lying on his back, with tears of relief streaming down his face. And there's everyone else, finally moving now that the danger has passed, rushing toward the 2 men with shouts and questions, and the belated urgency of people who wish they had acted sooner. The set medic arrived first, dropping to his knees beside Danny, and beginning the rapid assessment that would determine Whether the young grip needed an ambulance or a hospital or a morgue, his hands moved with professional efficiency, checking for broken bones, feeling for internal bleeding, shining a penlight into Danny's eyes to check for concussion. "He's going to be okay," the medic said after what felt like an eternity. "Bruised ribs, maybe a cracked one, and his left leg took some damage, but nothing that won't heal. He's one lucky son of a bitch." Wayne said nothing. He just sat there in the dust, looking at his scraped hands, breathing slowly while the adrenaline worked its way out of his system. Listen closely, because what happens in the next few hours will reveal something about Hollywood that most people never see. The studio executives arrived within the hour. Two men in expensive suits who had driven out from Los Angeles the moment they heard about the accident. Their faces arranged in expressions of concern that didn't quite reach their eyes. They went straight to the director first, then to the producer, conducting quiet conversations in the shade of the production tent, while the rest of the crew stood around wondering what would happen next. Wayne watched them from a distance. He had changed out of his costume and cleaned the worst of the dust off his face, but his hands were still raw, and there was a look in his eyes that anyone who knew him would have recognized as dangerous. "Mr. Wayne." One of the executives approached him with an outstretched hand and a smile that was all teeth. "I want to thank you personally for your quick thinking out there. You probably saved that young man's life." Wayne looked at the offered hand, but didn't take it. "Where's Danny?" "He's being taken to the hospital for observation. Just a precaution, I'm sure. The main thing is that everyone's okay, and we can put this unfortunate incident behind us." "Unfortunate incident." Wayne repeated the word slowly, as if tasting something bitter. "That's what you're calling it. Well, accidents happen on film sets. It's a dangerous business. The important thing is that we have procedures in place to—" "Your procedures are what almost killed him." The smile on the executive's face flickered, but didn't quite die. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean." "I mean that rig was a death trap. The bolts were loose, the support beam was cracked, and nobody bothered to check it properly because someone decided the inspection schedule was too expensive." Wayne stepped closer to the executive, and though he didn't raise his voice, every word carried the weight of barely contained fury. "I've been making pictures for 32 years. I've seen a lot of corners cut in the name of saving money, but I've never seen anything as reckless as what happened here today." Wait, because this is where the story starts to turn in a direction no one expected. The executive's smile finally faded, replaced by something colder and more calculating. "Mr. Wayne, I understand you're upset. We all are. But I would caution you against making accusations that could be misinterpreted." "Misinterpreted?" "The studio has a responsibility to protect its interests and its people. Making inflammatory statements about safety procedures could create legal complications that wouldn't benefit anyone, including young Mr. Murrow." Wayne stared at him for a long moment. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm simply pointing out that these situations are complicated. The best thing for everyone involved is to let the studio handle the investigation quietly, internally, without unnecessary publicity that could damage careers and reputations." "Including Danny's?" "Including everyone's." Notice the calculation behind those words. The executive wasn't worried about Danny Murrow. He wasn't worried about the other crew members who could have been killed. He was worried about lawsuits and bad press and the stock price of the parent company. He was worried about the things that men in expensive suits always worry about when working people get hurt. And John Wayne knew it. "Let me tell you something," Wayne said, his voice dropping to a register that made the executive take an involuntary step backward. "I've spent my entire career playing men who stand up for what's right. Men who don't back down when someone threatens them. Men who protect the people who can't protect themselves." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Most of the time, that's just acting. But not today. Today you're going to do exactly what I tell you, or I'm going to make sure that every newspaper in this country knows exactly what happened on this set and exactly who was responsible for letting it happen." The executive's face went pale. "You wouldn't try me. Remember what I said about stories the studio tries to bury? This is where you start to understand why they wanted to bury this one." The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour. It took place in the privacy of the production office, with the door closed and the blinds drawn, and no one who wasn't there ever knew exactly what was said. But when it was over, several things had changed. The shooting schedule was suspended for a full week, while every piece of equipment on the set was inspected by an independent safety firm. 3 other rigs were found to have similar defects, and all of them were replaced. The safety coordinator who had signed off on the faulty inspections was fired, along with the line producer who had approved the budget cuts that had delayed the maintenance schedule. And Danny Murrow, the grip who should have died under that collapsed rig, received a settlement from the studio that was large enough to pay off his mortgage and set up a college fund for his unborn child. He also received a personal guarantee from John Wayne that he would never work another day on a film set without proper safety protocols in place. But that's not where the story ends. That's not even where the important part begins. Listen carefully now, because what happens next is the moment that everyone on that set would remember for the rest of their lives. 3 days after the accident, when Danny had been released from the hospital, and the inspectors had finished their work, and the executives had gone back to their offices in Los Angeles, Wayne called a meeting, not a production meeting, something else entirely. He asked every member of the crew to gather on the main street of the set at 6 in the evening, after the day's work was done. They came, all of them, the grips and the gaffers, the camera operators and the sound technicians, the makeup artists and the costume designers, the wranglers and the stunt performers. They stood in the fading light of a California evening, looking at the man who had spent 30 years as the biggest star in Hollywood. Wayne stood on the wooden boardwalk, near the spot where Danny had almost died. He was wearing his street clothes, just a regular man in work boots and a plain shirt, and for once, he didn't look like John Wayne the legend. He looked like John Wayne the legend. He looked like John Wayne the person. "I'm not good at speeches," he said. "You all know that. But there's something I need to say, and I'm going to say it, whether it comes out right or not." He paused, looking out at the faces of the people who had worked beside him for months, people whose names he knew, whose families he had asked about, whose lives were as real and valuable as his own. "Before we go any further, you need to understand something about how this business works. There's a hierarchy on every film set, and everyone knows their place in it. The stars at the top, the crew at the bottom, and a whole complicated structure in between that determines who gets listened to and who gets ignored. Most of the time, it works well enough, but sometimes, like 3 days ago, it fails. And when it fails, the people at the bottom are the ones who pay the price." 3 days ago, Wayne continued, Danny Murrow almost died because someone decided that safety inspections cost too much money. Someone decided that the people who climb those rigs and move that equipment aren't worth the expense of making sure the machinery doesn't kill them. He let that sink in for a moment. "I've been making pictures for a long time, and in all those years, I've gotten pretty good at pretending. Pretending to be brave when the cameras are rolling. Pretending to be tough when the script calls for it. Pretending to be the kind of man who always does the right thing." He shook his head slowly. "But pretending isn't the same as being. And 3 days ago, I realized that I've spent too much time pretending and not enough time paying attention to the things that actually matter." Notice what's happening here. John Wayne, a man who had built his entire career on projecting strength and certainty, was standing in front of his crew and admitting that he had failed them. "I should have checked those rigs myself," Wayne said. "I should have asked more questions about the safety procedures. I should have made it clear a long time ago that no movie is worth a man's life, and that anyone who thinks otherwise has no business working on any picture I'm a part of. He took a breath. I didn't do those things. And because I didn't, Danny almost died. From somewhere in the crowd, Danny Murrow's voice cut through the silence. Mr. Wayne, that's not. Let me finish. Wayne's voice was gentle but firm. I'm not saying this to beat myself up. I'm saying it because it's true. And because I want all of you to understand something. From now on, things are going to be different on my sets. Not because the studio told me to, and not because I'm afraid of lawyers or newspapers, because it's the right thing to do. He looked directly at Danny, who was standing near the back of the crowd, with his arm in a sling and his leg in a brace. Every person on this crew matters. Every grip and gaffer and driver and assistant matters. You're not interchangeable parts that can be replaced when something breaks. You're human beings with families and dreams and lives that are just as important as mine. And anyone who doesn't understand that, anyone who thinks that schedules and budgets are more important than the people doing the work, doesn't belong here. Wait, because this is the moment that defines everything that comes after. I talked to the studio, Wayne said. They weren't happy about it, but I made them understand. From now on, there's going to be a safety representative on every set I work on. Someone whose only job is to make sure that what happened to Danny never happens again. Someone who reports directly to me, not to the producers or the accountants. And if anyone has a concern about anything at all, I want them to come to me first, not after someone gets hurt, before. The crew was silent. Not the shocked silence of the accident 3 days ago, but something different. The attentive silence of people who were hearing something they had never expected to hear from a man in Wayne's position. I can't change what happened, Wayne said. I can't give Danny back the weeks he's going to spend healing instead of working, but I can make damn sure that the next time I put on a costume and pretend to be brave, the people working beside me are actually safe. He paused. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you for listening. He stepped down from the boardwalk and walked toward Danny, who was watching him with an expression that was hard to read. How are you feeling? Wayne asked. Better. Danny looked at his injured arm, then back at Wayne. I heard what you did with the studio. I mean, the settlement, the safety changes. You didn't have to do any of that. Yeah, I did. Most stars wouldn't have. I'm not most stars. Wayne put a hand on Danny's good shoulder. And you're not just another grip. You're a man who came to work every day and did his job and almost died because someone else didn't do theirs. The least I can do is make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Wayne would remember for the rest of his life. My kid's going to be born in 4 months. A boy, the doctors say. He swallowed hard. I'm going to name him John, if that's okay with you. For the first time since the accident, Wayne smiled. It wasn't the confident grin of the movie star, or the cocky smirk of the Western hero. It was the genuine surprised smile of a man who had just received a gift he hadn't expected and wasn't sure he deserved. That's more than okay, he said. That's an honor. Listen, because this is where the story comes to its true ending. The picture finished shooting 6 weeks later, on schedule and under budget. Despite the week-long suspension, the critics called it one of Wayne's best performances. There was something different about him on screen. They said, a weight and a depth that hadn't been there before. None of them knew about Danny Murrow, or the collapsed rig, or the conversation that had changed everything. The studio made sure of that, but the crew knew. The people who had been there that day, who had watched John Wayne run toward danger while everyone else stood frozen, who had heard him stand up to the studio executives and demand changes that no star had ever demanded before. They knew the truth, and they told the story to other crews on other sets, and those crews told it to others, until it became one of those legends that everyone in Hollywood had heard but nobody could quite verify. The safety representative position that Wayne had insisted on became standard practice within a few years, not because the studios suddenly developed consciences, but because other stars started demanding the same thing, following Wayne's example. By the time Danny Murrow's son was old enough to understand the story of how he got his name, the film industry had changed in ways that his father could never have imagined. Danny himself went back to work. After 3 full months of recovery, he stayed in the business for another 30 years, eventually becoming a safety coordinator himself, one of the best in the industry, known for his meticulous attention to detail and his absolute refusal to cut corners. He kept a photograph on his desk, a picture of himself and John Wayne, taken on the day the crew gathered on the Western Street set, 2 men covered in dust and exhaustion, but somehow still standing. Years later, at Wayne's funeral in 1979, Danny was one of many hundreds of people who came to pay their respects. He stood in the back of the crowd, his son beside him, a young man now, tall and strong, bearing the name of a legend. When someone asked Danny what John Wayne had really been like, he thought for a long moment before answering. "He was a man who ran toward trouble when everyone else ran away," Danny said. "And he was a man who understood that the most important thing you can do in this life is protect the people who can't protect themselves." If you want to hear what happened to John Murrow Jr., Danny's son, the boy who was named after a legend, tell me in the comments now. Because he grew up to work in the film industry too, and the things he did to honor his namesake are a story all their own. And if you ever find yourself on a film set somewhere, look around at all the safety equipment and the inspection schedules and the representatives whose only job is to keep people alive. Remember that none of it existed before one afternoon in 1965, when a lighting rig collapsed on a Western Street set, and one man decided that pretending to be brave wasn't enough anymore. That's the part they don't put in the credits. But maybe it's the most important part of all.